Well, we're moving into the next portion of our program, and to keep everything on time so that we can give full time to our keynote on property taxes, which I'm sure you all want to hear, I'm going to restart. As we get into the program, as you're getting settled, let me just say a couple things. That we're very pleased to have cooperation of our colleagues across the higher education system in Montana, including some of the contributors you see to our Montana Economic Report. I'll obviously recognize each of the folks as they come up here and deliver their talks, but I just want to take a moment right now to thank the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics at Montana State University, and also the Extension Center, the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research and the College of Forestry and Conservation here at UM, as well as the Montana Manufacturing Extension Center in the School of Engineering at Montana State. Their participation really greatly adds to the expertise we're able to bring with you in these programs. So we're going to start right back up with another very important industry for Montana, and that's tourism and visitor spending. So to talk about the outlook, we have for the director of the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research at University of Montana. Will you please join me in welcoming Norman Nickerson?
Good morning. How's everybody doing? Got your caffeine? Ready to go? I was telling Bryce just a few minutes ago I was going to steal his ball and say, okay, who is the real best speaker? And nope, not Bryce. No, just kidding. He's a great speaker. It's fun to listen to him. So I'm going to go into all sorts of fun information about travel and recreation in the state of Montana and a little bit what's going on and where we think it's going to be going. And I'd like to start out to say what happened in this past year. And of course, these are preliminary numbers, but they're pretty darn close. And you'll see on there that it says 7%, and we have a little bit more data now, and now it's an 8% increase of visitors to the state of Montana. Not you guys driving around, but people coming into our state. 11.6 million visitors. And you know we don't have a population equal to that, so we are outnumbered during some of these times. But it's a growth, and it's a big growth at 8%. What's interesting about that is you'll hear in a minute that our spending wasn't quite the same. Tourism business owners, they too, 59% of them said that they thought, or not that they thought, that they had an increase in visitation to their various businesses and attractions and whatnot around the state of Montana. 19% of them said it stayed the same compared to last year, so those two numbers are good because the year before was a good year. And so again, they're feeling good about what went on in 2015. But we have 22% of them said that they saw a decrease. And as we look at that data, we start thinking, when we get the spending data in there, were they thinking spending or their revenue and not the number of people? Because we had an 8% decrease in spending in 2015. So we had an 8% increase in the number of people and 8% decrease in spending. What is going on out there? Well, there's a few factors that I can pretty much guarantee contributed to it. The price of gas. Bing. In the past, when I would show you this pie chart, gasoline was 32% of the non-resident dollar that they were spending in Montana. And a lot of that just escapes right outside of Montana immediately. We had a 36% decrease in spending in gasoline in 2015. Huge decrease. Another thing, and it's already been mentioned, is our dollar is strong and the Canadian dollar is not strong. We may not see it as much here, but certainly Whitefish, Kalispell, Great Falls, all along the High Line, they know that the Canadians didn't come down in groves like they did and spend as much money as they have in the past 4 years. So that's a big factor. And the other one I'll talk about a little bit later is related to millennials and their spending patterns and how they do things. But when you look at this chart, what was up, what was down, this doesn't tell you. This was just the percent of the dollar. But the other things that were down, and it's an odd little mixture. Restaurant and bar appears to be down 7% over the previous year. Groceries and snacks appear to be down 12%. I guess they come here and they're not eating. Maybe that's what it is. Everybody's on that diet. But what was increasing is fascinating. And while we don't have a good comparison number, we started asking some things a little bit differently in 2015 of the non-residents coming here. But if it's even close to this, it's huge. The farmers markets and how many people spent money at farmers markets while they were visiting Montana went up 263%. Again, probably not quite that much, and then especially if you start low and you just add a few more, it looks like a big increase. But it's still an increase. Campground RV parks were up 36%. Licenses, entry fees, those sorts of things, that was up 146%. And then hotel motel was up 4%, not a whole lot, but it was. Rental cabins, condos where you're doing more of the weekly stay, that sort of thing, was up 8%. And what's interesting, we started asking about what they purchased that was made in Montana. So, when you're at farmers market, that could be part of it. Now we ask them specifically about made in Montana products. And that is showing with our retail then, that retail was up 10%, kind of going along with what Pat was saying earlier about, consumer spending in that sense. But it's not as much as Outfitter and Guide was up 22%, and we are asking that a little bit differently too. We think we're getting better data. And this is, again, I'll come back to this as to why this is going on and what we think is going on with it and how it's relating to the millennials. So where are they spending this money? This particular chart is showing you that Flathead, Gallatin, Yellowstone, Missoula, and Cascade are the top 5 counties that get the money dropped by non-residents in there. And this is, lots of money that's going in there. We do it over a 2-year time frame because our sample size, we want to have it big enough. And all of these counties that are listed there are ones that had over $20 million or more dropped in their particular county. If you look at it a little bit differently, you'll see that the shaded counties are the top 10, and they represent 72% of all non-resident money that is coming into the state of Montana. They're the ones who receive these dollars coming in. Gallatin and Flathead are always going to be the highest recipient of these non-resident dollars. We've got Yellowstone and Glacier, and that I don't think will ever go away. But what you notice is the path between Glacier and Yellowstone, those counties are also pretty high. And then you have this little outlier out there, which is Custer, where Miles City is, and a lot of people can't make it all the way across, so they have to stop somewhere, and they're stopping in Miles City and spending some money there as well. But in Helena, I had somebody ask the question, well, how many people are traveling between Glacier and Yellowstone on their trip and going to both parks? So I had to go look that up afterwards. Too bad I couldn't find that person afterwards and tell them what it was. But it's basically 15% of the non-residents are going to both parks. And when they're going to both parks, in another study, we looked at their travel patterns, and 54% of them are not going up and back on the same route. They're doing a loop. And so what they're doing is spreading their money around in a better way for the various counties, and that's kind of what you see in this particular slide. Okay, you've heard about this, and it's very true. Yes, it was a banner year for our parks. Yellowstone National Park was up nearly 17% this year compared to last year, the highest ever visitation they've experienced in the history of Yellowstone. And Yellowstone is the oldest and first national park in the world. So they had an incredible year. And Glacier was even up around 1%. You remember what happened to Glacier? The east side was closed for 2.5 weeks because of the fire that was going on there. Still had a record year for Glacier National Park. So, you might think this is all good and wonderful and everything else, but what we're seeing, the park superintendents now, and this isn't just in Montana national parks, it's around the country. they're kind of scrambling a little bit. They have to protect that natural resource, but they also have to provide that quality experience, and they have to maintain that experience by making sure those visitors are doing all the right things and not destroying the resource, and it gets to be this vicious cycle. And Paul, a little bit earlier, talked about the federal government and the number of jobs that are being decreased, and mentioned the national parks, the Forest Service, and the BLM, and it's very true. In the Parks, Tourism, and Recreation program in the College of Forestry that I am involved with, we see jobs, people retiring, and the federal government is not replacing most of those jobs, and so our students are having a harder time. They can get seasonal jobs, but going out there and getting those full-time ones. So why am I bringing that up is, as our visitation increases and the number of people in those parks and the forests decrease, we are going to be seeing, and we already are, a decay in that infrastructure in those parks, and that's because there's not enough boots on the ground, if you will, of rangers who can help direct the right kind of behavior and that sort of thing going on in the park for the resources. I'm hoping that this doesn't continue, because it's going to be a scary situation down the line at some point. Oops, I didn't mean to do that because I forgot about the ski areas. Ski areas. You know, it's always hard to remember what happened a year ago, but this is, last year's ski numbers, and we were down 10%. We didn't have the best snow year last year. This year is a little bit better. Still not the best, but I think it's going to go up for this year. What we're seeing is there's still a lot of snow on the ground in the valleys, and we drove to Helena on Monday, and there was snow all the way to Helena. So when you have snow on the ground, you folks are more likely to go up and ski and not start polishing off your golf clubs. So this is a good thing for the ski resorts, even if the snow isn't as good as you would like it to be. It's out there. Airport deboardings. You heard Bryce talking about Bozeman and healthcare and why it's going up and its population and everything else. 3 years ago, I mentioned it, that the airport in Bozeman is now the biggest airport in Montana. And Billings, it's still a good airport, and it's a big one, but it can't keep up with what Bozeman has been doing. And so, the Billings airport was up 2%, Bozeman was up basically 5%. You know what's going on in Bozeman. I think you just heard on the news, was it last week, that they're now getting another direct flight into, I think it's Houston, maybe it was Dallas, Fort Worth, I can't remember which Texas town, but they're getting more and more direct flights. And if you know anything about business people and even the leisure traveler, it's much more fun to get on a flight at home and get off where you wanted to be, rather than changing planes. And Bozeman is getting really good at doing that. They're able to tell these airlines, we will subsidize you if those planes aren't full or to the capacity that they need, and they've never had to pay anything. So Bozeman is growing, and it will continue to grow. We had a little bit of decrease in Butte, well, 6% actually, and a little bit of decrease in Great Falls. But overall in the state, we had a 2% increase, 2.5% in the entire state of airport deboardings. And as we do get more different airline options coming in here and flights, those are going to increase. So I talk about tourism a lot, and that tourism and recreation thing kind of go hand in hand. This is a nationwide report that is put out by the Outdoor Foundation that they do every year, and they look at a lot of different things, but what are the most popular activities, outdoor activities that people are doing around the country? And they broke it down between the 6 to 24-year-olds and then 25 and older. And they're the same list. They're just in a little bit different order, but these people, us, the young people, the old people, are all wanting to do and are doing the running, jogging, trail running type thing. That is the most popular one that we have out there. Bicycling, and that's all types of bicycling. Road, mountain, BMX is very popular. A little bit less so with the older people, but not so much. Fishing, all different types, freshwater, saltwater, fly fishing, all of that. People are doing that. It's very popular. Camping, both the car and RV camping. And then hiking, which goes along with those other trails. And you'll notice in Missoula and other places around Montana, trails are becoming one of those things that the cities, parks and rec departments are trying to make sure that they get out there. It helps with the health of the people in their community. It gets used as a commuter trail, so hopefully it will take cars off the road. So this trail thing is not going to go away. It's only going to get bigger, and I think we're going to see more and more bicyclists and people out walking along these trails as we do that. And you know, here we're going to get that connector trail between Missoula and Lolo, the bike path that'll be, I think it'll be, you can go on it probably now, but it's officially opening this summer. I'll tell you, I'm going to be one. I'm signing up. My husband doesn't like to bike, but he's going to do this because he said he would. We're going to bike from our house in the Upper Rattlesnake all the way to Hamilton, spend the night, and come back. And I don't have to go on the highway. And to me, that's a huge draw. And I think we're going to see a lot of that going on with other people as well. Okay, let's talk about the demographics and those millennials. All right? So millennials travel differently than the boomers do. 2015 marked the first time that the millennial population is bigger than the boomer population. So if you were born between 1980 and 1995, you now rule. The boomers who were born between 1946 and 1964, we have to take second place. All right? What's going on with those millennials? Okay, they love to travel. They now represent 1/4 of the population. And yet the boomers' total travel expenditures grew 45% in 2014, probably the same in 2015, and millennials actually decreased in their spending from the previous year. So what is it? They are embracing that sharing economy, and you've heard about this, maybe a little bit, maybe not so much, but there was another Uber thing on the national news yesterday. Uber is part of the sharing economy. That's that taxi ride service that I could get behind my own car and give you a ride. You know, I'd get on there and I'd take you wherever you wanted to go. But there's more of the millennials who are embracing this. So Airbnb, if you haven't heard of that, it's where you sleep in someone else's home when you're traveling, pay a little bit for being able to have that opportunity to sleep there. The VRBOs and the HomeAways, and then there's couch surfing. Again, sleeping in somebody's home. Warm showers is what the bicycling community calls it, and they sign up, and as they're biking along, they'll stay in somebody's house. More and more of those millennials are doing that. The Uber, which is the ride share. Trip for Real and Vayable are local guide services. So again, you could say, Norma, well, you wouldn't say this because you wouldn't know me, but you know, you want somebody to take you around downtown Missoula. I wouldn't be a good one for this, but let's say I was. And I could maybe do a little historic walking tour with you, and you would pay me to do this. You know, unfortunately, with this sharing economy, it doesn't a lot of times share the tax thing. And so this is why this works for a lot of people. They can make it's kind of like getting a tip. And many people don't provide to the IRS some of those tip monies that they get. So what's happening? Taxis, guided trips, hotels are seeing that they're not supplying what the millennials want. Why don't the millennials do what everybody's been doing in the past? Well, you've heard and you've seen the economy, what's going on. There's a student debt thing going on there, and they love experiences. So they're going after the experiences, and what better way than to come over here and have Norma give you a ride around town and tell you what I think Missoula is all about. It's an immersion into the local people, and that's what they're going after. And then just a recent study found that 27% of the millennials who were traveling for leisure used Airbnb or the VRBO for their overnight stays, and only 5% of the boomers did. This is pointing to a different business model in the travel industry as we have known it, and we're going to have to watch that pretty closely to see what's going on. Okay, international travel in Montana. This is an interesting one because really only about 2% of the non-resident visitors to Montana are from overseas. About 14% have been the Canadians. I think that's going to decrease a little bit now. But what's interesting about this list that you see on the slide is a survey that we did of the tourism businesses around the state and asking them about international and overseas travelers and where were they in the numbers of people that they saw at their businesses. And the United Kingdom came on top, followed by China, Germany, Japan, Australia, France, and Netherlands. And we get them from all over, but these were the ones that most of them mentioned were their top ones. What's interesting is Visa View, which is part of Visa credit card, provides data to anybody who wants to spend a little bit money, and I was asking about it, so they gave me some information. But in 2008, they looked at where the money was coming from, those people who charge on Visa, you have to keep that in mind, what country they were coming from. And in 2008, China didn't even appear on the scene, wasn't even in there. In 2014, it was in the top 5. The spending that's done by the overseas travelers in Montana. Things are changing. And then when you talk to the folks, and if you've been to Yellowstone especially, a little bit of Glacier, but it hasn't really hit Glacier as much as Yellowstone, the Chinese are definitely in Yellowstone National Park. And so that little sign that you see on the left side of that screen is something that the Tetons are putting up right now, because what they found out is they go to the vault toilets, all over your park, and the seat would be broken and there'd be footprints on it. And they, for the longest time, couldn't figure it out. And then they realized it's a different culture who's coming here. They do not use the toilets like we do. And so now they had to come up with an international sign, because we don't speak their language, Mandarin, most of them, and they don't speak English. So there is no way to really talk to this group of people who are now starting to come to our national parks, and then they're going to be spreading out all over. So it's a cultural difference that we, as a society of Montana in the United States, have to realize we need to get a better communication going on. The Park Service is behind the ball game here. They've got to figure out, Tetons are doing this. I don't even know if the other parks have come to this solution. But we have to put up other international type signs that anybody can recognize and not expect people to know how to speak and read English. So with that, I think in your book it says 2015, and I changed it to 2016. You can do that in your book. But what's going on? What's the outlook look like? And what are the indicators? Discretionary income is up. That's a good sign for the travel and recreation industry. Unemployment is steady, which means that they probably have a job that's going to allow them eventually to go on a trip sometime. Household debt is down, except for the millennials who have started to go and purchase some of these homes. And then that is driving, again, that experience economy, because they don't have as much money. They're going to travel because they really want to. They have to do it at a less expensive way of going. U.S. dollar is strong. Intention to travel is up. But what's interesting, from a national survey, they're saying that people want to stay closer to home. And that one kind of goes against the fact that gas prices are so good. So I don't know what's going on there, but maybe that's a cheaper way to go too, and a millennial thing. Gas prices, again, are low. And there is this thing about election jitters. People don't know what's going to happen. And so they either go and do something now because they know what's going on right now, or they hold off because they think that something they need to wait and see what's going to go on. So what is the Montana outlook? Well, you've seen, I assume, some of those ads on TV, go find your park. Well, it's the National Park Service centennial year, and they're really wanting people to get out and go to the parks. And now some of these parks are probably saying, go find a different park. Go find a park, but just don't come. No, they wouldn't do that. But we expect increases. So we had a banner year for both Glacier and Yellowstone, unless, something big changes, like a forest fire comes along or whatever it might be. They're going to increase again. Only 5% of the Montana tourism businesses we surveyed said that they expect a decrease in 2016, so they're very positive. Interestingly, we had said last year that we thought spending would be up 2 to 5%, and it was down. Now I'm wondering if we do have the new normal, and when you look at the millennial, the sharing economy, things are changing. And then the Made in Montana products and the Montana experiences are going to be what is going to help the growth in the Montana economy, because when you think about it, it's the people who are making something here, living here because people are buying their product or their services, and they can stay and live in Montana. So with that, I will open it up for any questions, and I think I'm right on time.
Do you see any differences in the trends of state of Montana parks versus federal?
Well, all the parks have been going up this past year, and the larger parks, you know, we're talking the Yosemites and the Grand Canyons and, you know, Arches. So here's an example with Arches. The sheriff actually came, the lineup to get into Arches was out onto the highway, and the sheriff came along and said, okay, that's it, nobody else is going in the park. We got to get this road open. And this is starting to happen. West Yellowstone had the same thing a number of times this year. It was backed up to the highway, and so the rangers just came right up at the gate and just, okay, everybody get in. Of course, they get in a couple miles and the bison stopped them, and then it would back up all the way to the gate. So, you know, you can't win that one, but it's going on right now all over the country, and certainly the bigger parks.
What are you seeing around local and state policies related to encouraging or disincentivizing the new economy around tourism with Airbnb and VRBO and those kinds of
That's a
experiences?
Very good question. Really, around the country even, they don't quite know how to deal with it because a lot of it's under the radar and they can't, if you will, catch people. It's going to change. You know, one of the things that I think the state of Montana did a number of years ago was they were suing like Travelocity and some of these other companies that help sell hotel rooms, and we have that bed tax here, and they weren't supplying the bed tax dollars, so that kind of thing. There's a lot that's going to be going on. It just hasn't caught up to where it's at right now in terms of the volume that's going on there. I don't know. If nobody complains, then it'll just keep on going, but I think things will change. Anytime you're talking a loss of tax revenue, you know, somebody's going to go after that somewhere.
Norma, good morning.
Good
Ed
morning.
Grief. At the legislature last session, you brought some data and on spending and patterns, specifically on the tourism, bicycle tourism impact on the state. And there were some really interesting figures there, and I wonder if you could take just a brief moment and share some of that with us. Those are amazing statistics, I think.
Sure. Thanks, Ed. So we did a study a couple years ago on bicycle tourism in the state of Montana, and when we talk about bicycle tourism, the people who were in the study had to spend at least one night away from home and be on their bicycle, okay? That was part of it. And we estimated between the big numbers that we get that about 500,000 people are on their bicycle at least overnight, once during their time on that trip in Montana. And what we also found is the bicycle folks actually spend more money than the average non-resident visitor to the state of Montana. Now, Ed, I have to tell you that our next set of data is showing a little bit different on that. They're closer, and actually the non-resident spent a little bit more than the bicycle tourist. But it's still quite a bit higher in general, and they spend it on the local things. They love, you know, Missoula should really do well with this because they love breweries, local breweries, you know. And I guess they need their carbs, and so they do their hard biking all day long and head right to the local brewery. And they you know, and they're immersing themselves in our state, and they're here way longer than anybody else. We just did another study on bicycling in Glacier this summer, and 5% of the people who rode a bike at any point in time while they were in Montana and they ended up in Glacier spent over 30 nights in the state of Montana on their trip. And you don't get that with the regular non-resident traveler, especially the vacationer. They're here 6 nights. So you got a big difference. So overall, their impact could be really big. And I know Ed was working on getting a bill in related to bike path maintenance and some education. You're going to see more and more of that. It's a healthy lifestyle, and it's a great way for people to see a state or an area. So thank you. Thank you.
Our next speaker will talk about the outlook for agriculture, which is certainly changing and certainly challenging today. Please join me in welcoming Professor and Extension Specialist in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics at Montana State University, Bozeman, Mr. George Haynes.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Pat. Yeah, it's been a really a very different year in agriculture. We'll talk a little bit about the last 2 quarters, starting in really the mid-June to through December, and you can see it's been a really difficult year for many agricultural producers, especially the grain people. I think maybe more so than your farmer and rancher friends that are out there. But it's been certainly a different year than we've had more recently. In June, these producers started off thinking they were going to get $6 or so for their wheat, and turned out, a lot of them, by the time fall rolled around, got about $4 a bushel. Cattle market was people thinking they were going to get $2.75 for their calves. They could end up, getting down in $1.75 sort of range, by the time the market settled for some of them. So some very dramatic sorts of stories. I think there's probably 2 stories that are very important. One of them, when I talk to you about grain today, think about just glut. We've had a worldwide production records, we have storage records as well. We just have a lot of grain around, so that's what's really impacting the grain markets. On the cattle side, the word is expansion. You think, well, expansion is a good thing. Well, it is a good thing overall for consumer prices, but for cattle producers, it means lower prices, and so we'll talk about those in some detail as we work through this. So the story on the cattle side has been one, as I suggested before, really declining prices. The story is right at the very top. There's finally some very strong evidence of some herd rebuilding, which has finally occurred. And keep in mind that we've lived off of the drought that occurred in the Southwest, and it's really in kind of 2011 going forward. Been a big deal for us in Montana because the number of cattle declined, and of course calf prices went through the ceiling. We had some historically high prices. Beef exports, as well as we'll see with grain exports, have been low. Not such a big deal in the cattle business because we don't export, only export about 10% of that production. And then we've had this really high level of imports coming in as a result of this strong dollar case that Pat talked about. All of a sudden, they're relatively cheap for us. The Australians shipped in 38% of all of our imports. So if you've been to McDonald's or Wendy's or so on, you've probably had some Australian beef more recently. On the crop side of it, it's again declining prices, and in the story I said, it's just a worldwide glut that's out there. I'll talk a little bit about some things that are very exciting happening here with the pulse markets in particular, peas and lentils for some more common language, and the local foods market, which is really exciting here in Missoula and Gallatin counties in particular. We'll talk to you a little bit, some anecdotal sort of stories I have to tell. So what happened with cash receipts? Well, if you look at the 5 or 6 bars to the left of the last bar on the right, you'll notice that the agricultural community missed the recession. Farmers and ranchers didn't know anything about what happened during the Great Recession here, but things have changed. We're forecasting about a 25% decline in income, or of cash receipts, which translates into income. In Montana, U.S.-wide, it's probably down by about 40% or thereabouts, but that's because the cattle feeding industry last year had just some record losses. It was a very difficult year for cattle feeders throughout the U.S. Some of the story has been the drought story, and the biggest story of all is one that there's no color on the map, and that's because there's not very much color down in the Southwest. That's where this cattle herd growth is all happening, where it's happening there as well as in northern Mexico. So some of the dynamics we had before that played into very important price increases here are really gone. The California situation as of October didn't look so good either, and this tells you a little bit of what was going on last summer, but that benefited us some in Montana because we had some cattle that came this way because it was so dry in California. We had a lot of hay that went to California, which was good because our export market for hay wasn't so good, again, because of the strong dollar. We used to stuff container cars full of hay and ship it to China, but not so much of that this time around, but still a lot of it flowed to California. So some important impacts. California situation is getting somewhat better as we look in the near term. Drought status across Montana was really kind of an interesting phenomenon last year. We were in relatively good shape for most of the state. There were 15 counties in the west that actually had very dry conditions, so dry that the farmers took their combines out and drove them around the fields. They weren't cutting any grain, but they drove them around the field, so they had tracks out there so the insurance agent would give them the proper adjustment, which meant they had no yield. So some tough stories for about 15 counties in the West. So let's talk about cattle. This is U.S. cattle inventory. The Montana cattle inventory is even more boring than this, because it's just a straight line that runs across there at about 2.5 million head. But the big story is that little nick that's in the bottom right-hand corner, because we've had this long downturn in cattle numbers in the U.S., and all of a sudden that little nick has turned out to make a difference. They're seeing some expansion. In fact, there's new numbers out today that little nick has gotten a little bit higher. It's because cattle numbers are continuing to increase. That's what's causing this challenge in the market. This is what happened to cattle prices, over the year. The blue line that's there is really 2014 numbers, and the little blob over in the right-hand corner, the bubble, is cattle prices as they were in kind of October of this year. So you can see the really substantial decline that occurred in those numbers. We'll look at this in a little more detail. Keeping in mind that the kind of break even, as I kind of think about it at least, for these cattle producers, probably about $1.50 a pound. So if you see these little calves running around out here, they weigh about 600 pounds, and if you get about $1.50 a pound out of them, you're probably doing okay. Here's what the story looked like a year ago. You could have made a lot of money in the cattle business by buying a few calves early and then just hanging on to them and feeding them, because prices went up throughout 2014. And remember, we had this kind of average 10-year price of about $1.50 or so. So there's some money to be made in that market. A lot of new pickups bought, I would suggest, probably over that in 2014 and a little bit prior to that. Here's what happened when this market turned, and it turned really in around the 1st of June. These commodity markets started to move, and they moved very rapidly. This doesn't show you all the volatility that's in the market, but some very happy ranchers that I knew back in June were very not so happy as we approached the end of the year. If we look downstream, we have the commodity markets to do the forecasting for me, and as we look downstream from here, it's looking that by about September, October of 2016, these $1.75 sort of prices that I was talking to you about before are really what the market is forecasting. So if we look kind of a year-to-year sort of downturn in this market, really substantial change in calf prices. And that's what matters to us here in Montana. Nothing else matters too much. We don't feed very many cattle here. We don't background many of them. So we're really concerned about how these commercial cow-calf people are doing. And it's some lower prices. But again, keep in mind that $1.78 is still above $1.50. So there's still a little bit of money to be made there. Okay, on the crop side of this, nothing changes too much in Montana crop agriculture, especially with grain, as you move from one year to the next. Some of it is just crop rotation sorts of issues and so on. If you look at here, spring wheat's the one at the very top. It's a little bit of volatility in that. Some reduction in acreage this year caused the numbers to be a little lower. Winter wheat's the blue line in the middle, and not too much going on there. A little bit of reduction in acreage, but not very much, and pretty standard yields across there, pretty consistent yields. The green line is barley. If you'd all drink more beer and get some more breweries here, we could really do a lot to improve that number. Really, the strength in the barley market is because of the malting barley business in Montana. That's really substantial. And the most important line in many ways is the one at the very bottom. This is pulse crops. And we'll talk a little bit about peas and lentils here in just a minute. Okay, the glut, the bottom line on this is the most important. As you notice, worldwide wheat production moved up from 720 or thereabouts million metric tons to 733. Big increases in production last year worldwide, and some really high forecasts this year as well of wheat production increases. Some of the stories were in the former Soviet Union countries. Those numbers were up substantially. You had to move a little bit further south of there, India, their numbers were down. But across worldwide production markets, things pretty much the same. But we're sitting on large stocks of wheat at the moment, and until that situation remedies itself, putting some pretty substantial downward pressure on prices. Grain production here in Montana was relatively stable across this period of time. Not too many stories to tell other than just a little bit of acreage reduction on in the kind of spring wheat arena. Barley and spring wheat remained pretty much the same. The grain price story, you notice there's a substantial downturn that really started in 2011, has kind of been downtrending since then. We're down in this range where, if you want to think about grain prices in general, everything at the end of the year, at least in 2015, average prices were hanging around about $6. With barley, moving up into that range with the wheat and spring and winter wheat prices here, primarily because of all of this malt barley that's being raised in Montana, and the influence of Malt Europe over in Great Falls that sells to all the microbrewers here, or many of the microbrewers here in Montana. So it's been a very important piece of the puzzle. So what happened to these wheat farmers in the state? Well, this is kind of what wheat prices look like in 2014 as we move from month to month, really, kind of around that, $6.50 to $7 level. Everybody making a little bit of money at those levels because the average prices of wheat kind of around $5.50 a bushel is kind of where I think people kind of break even in this market. And then June hit. And these grain markets really began to decline very substantially. And as you can see here, they really moved below historical averages of grain. And now we're down with these farmers that had to haul grain to market in the fall. And this is kind of your smaller producers that don't have a lot of storage capacity. We're taken sometimes in the upper threes, $3 a bushel to deliver this grain to these elevators. So some really tough times for many of these smaller guys that just didn't have storage capacity to handle this. So watch the grain. It's going to be a really significant impact here in Montana as these prices have moved below what I think are really break-even prices in that market. If we look at the futures prices on wheat, it doesn't look too rosy either. You're looking out there at that September number and say, well, $5.24, that's not very far below what you just told me of $5.50. Well, we have to deduct about $1 off of these prices, though, to take care of transportation from here to the coast. So, we're looking at probably $4.25 for these producers if we look at the forecast coming off of the futures markets that are here. So some challenging times, I think, to put it mildly, for these producers as we look downstream. Hay production's become a bigger deal in the state of Montana more recently because we've had some huge hay markets, especially in Asia, but more recently in Southern California as well. These hay markets we've seen production increase a little bit over time. There's been a little bit of volatility in that, down just a little bit last year because of some weather conditions. But hay prices have remained above historical averages. Historical average, right around $110 or so a ton for hay, and we've been able to retain prices that are substantially higher than that. In fact, a little over $120 a ton, and depending on the quality you're selling, substantially above that. Okay, one of the more interesting stories that's happened in Montana has been the story around pulse production. Peas and lentils primarily. Well, how do we get into peas and lentils business? Well, a bit of history is important because North Dakota used to be the big producers in peas and lentils, but with GMO crops and the high production off of those, corn and soybeans in particular, they have transitioned to those crops, and some of this pea and lentil business has come our way to Montana. And you can notice the black line is the big story. This is pea production in Montana. We expect that by the end of, this is acreage, it's on this little story here. We're expecting by the end of this year to have 1 million acres pulse crops. Well, that's about half the acreage we have in winter wheat in Montana. So that's a really substantial change. And what it is, it's a crop rotation issue. If you plant these pulse crops, you get a little bit of nitrogen in the soil, so you don't have to use as much fertilizer, and so there's some substantial gains. And as long as it continues to rain, we have good moisture conditions, pulse crops will likely be a profitable venture for many of our producers. The one on the bottom is lentils, and lentils are primarily sold to India. We sell and it's been a very good market for us, as you can see here with the number of pounds that have been produced. Pulse prices have remained, relatively good. This last year we saw some decline in edible pea prices. Lentil prices were up substantially. They're, if you think about them, they're about 22 cents a pound or thereabouts for lentils. So some opportunities to make some money in these markets. It was a very interesting production year in both of these crops, because we had their annual production, they said, average yields per acre were down about a third just because of weather conditions that they face. So some production volatilities in these crops were of some concern. So one of the issues that's we're doing more and more work with at Montana State is on farmers markets and local foods. With farmer markets, it's been an interesting sort of ride. I think there is, according to the Montana Department of Ag, there's about 71 of those markets in Montana. They have about $2 million or thereabouts in sales. If you think about the whole agricultural complex, worth around $5 billion or so. It's a small piece of that. But it's been a growing market, although I think that what we're seeing in that market is we're seeing at least the agricultural products that are flowing into those markets still growing some, but the rate of growth appears to be slowing. The second piece of this, the local foods market, and you ought to be very proud of what's going on here in Missoula, because it is setting the standards for everybody in Montana, but the local foods market is growing and growing pretty rapidly, with some very interesting stories that are there. You think about irrigated agriculture in Montana, since my wife's family are involved in sugar beets, which is our highest valued crop. You get about 30 ton to the acre, and they get about $60 a ton or thereabouts for those sugar beets, so you get $1,800 or so an acre. Local foods, they're irrigated agriculture as well, and gross revenue on those farms, and I'll give you only one that's publicly out there, because we're working with a number of farmers now. I have lots of other anecdotal evidence, but from $20,000 to $25,000 an acre. There's lots of opportunity in local foods, and what is that landscape now looking like? Well, they run their community-supported agriculture. They sell to the restaurants. They sell to the grocery stores. They sell to aggregators. You have some aggregators here in Missoula, and we do in Bozeman. They now market those products in about a 200-mile radius out of those communities. And what they're trying to sell to people is taste. And it appears to me that some of these people, they're successful in selling taste on the market. I see there appears to me to be a substantial amount of momentum in local foods, and we are spending our entire winter working on crop budgeting exercises for local foods, because we want to know what's going on in the markets. What do they face? The biggest challenge that they face out there is no insurance. There's all kinds of insurance if you grow barley and wheat in Montana, and all kinds of farm programs for you, but nothing for these small producers. And so we're working feverishly, would be probably the right word for that right at the moment, to help them figure out how they might insure their crops even with this upcoming crop season, with either support from the Farm Service Agency or from the Risk Management Agency, which handles most of our farmers in Montana. So crop insurance becoming a really substantial issue for them. But I think there's reason for lots of excitement in that market in many ways. How many of those producers they can handle in any one community, I guess I haven't sorted that out in my own mind yet. But talking to one of our bright young farmers in Bozeman the other day, and he said, I think we have probably captured 1 or 2% of the market. So I think there's market share to be had out there probably for these producers, but an exciting place to be. Okay, just in a quick summary. Livestock, herd expansion. If you talk to a rancher out there, you can't think of anything else you want to talk to him about. Just mention the word expansion, and his eyes will light up, because he'll want to talk to you about how difficult things are. But lower prices because of the herd expansion taking place. if you're talking to a grain farmer out here, they're all aware, supplies are very high, and production forecasts for next year are also very high at the moment. So looks like there's challenges on the price side of that. And just to mention local foods one more time, appears to be a substantial amount of potential, and boy, as Missoula taught the rest of Montana some important lessons. Your people up here have been great in moving that market forward. So I would be happy to take a question or two. So.
How much does the reduction in the price of oil impact the costs to producers, both cattle and grains, and how does that impact their bottom line?
Okay. Thanks for the question. It was asked to me in Great Falls a couple days ago, and I punted on the question because I hadn't looked at the data, but I did this morning. It looks to me like for grain producers in particular, I think that it's reducing their break-even cost probably about 50 cents. That's primarily, fertilizer and gasoline, those are the two impacts of energy. They comprise about 35% of a budget. So you can work out but on the cattle side, probably you're only going to get the fuel part of that on the cattle side. And so I think you're looking at probably about 6 or 7%, something like that, maybe reduction in what those break-evens might be. So a much bigger issue for the grains people than for the cattle people when you think about it, because fertilizer is such that's a much bigger component of what goes on in grains.
Is local foods, is that mostly vegetables, or are there other crops, and how about grass-fed beef?
Okay, let's tackle the local foods. Our producers, as your producers here in Missoula, they produce about 100 varieties of different crops. Most of that is, about 2/3 of that is going to be edible vegetable type things. And then they will do some horticulture as well, which things you probably don't necessarily want to eat. But on the grass-fed beef side of that, that is gaining some momentum. I don't know how large that market is in the state of Montana. We have some anecdotal evidence. We're working with a couple producers that do grass-fed beef. They're trying to, they do, almost all their, in fact, a majority of their marketing is local, not all of it. Some of there's a feedlot up in north central Montana that actually, you might not believe this, but does their own grass-fed beef. And that's all marketed into Southern California, so some of that. But that market, has there's some growth potential in it as well, it appears to me. But I know a little bit less about that market because I haven't done any cost of production studies on that particular market yet.
Okay, we're right against our time, but thanks, George. It was a great discussion. We're now going to turn to look at a very exciting industry, one that I said this morning is contributing to growth, and that's manufacturing, which includes forest products. So joining us to discuss the outlook for manufacturing and forest products is our very own Director of Forest Industry Research. Please join me in welcoming Todd Morgan.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Good morning, everyone. I want to jump right off here and show you all a map of about 1,200 manufacturing facilities here in the state of Montana. This is from our Montana Manufacturing Information System online database of manufacturers around the state. And kind of the point I wanted to make with this is that, of course, you can see the manufacturers are clustered around the larger cities in the state, but they're also spread out all throughout the state. So here in Montana, manufacturing is not just an urban industry. Now, a little bit more of what manufacturing does look like in the state. We have about 23,400 workers in manufacturing. That includes self-employed, making about $1.2 billion annually in labor income. That's the 2014 figure. And that represents about 5.5% of private non-farm earnings in the state. And so manufacturing pays a little bit better than average wages and benefits in Montana compared to the average job. Now on the pie chart there, you get a feel for what the largest sectors are by payroll or by earnings. The petroleum products, the refineries, the biggest income there for workers. But wood products and furniture is actually the largest sector in terms of number of employees, with about 4,500 jobs. And food and beverage there is the second largest when you combine the two together, at about 4,200 jobs statewide. Kind of one of the several bright spots in manufacturing news is that Montana manufacturing employment has generally been outperforming employment for the U.S. manufacturing sector. You can get a handle here. You can see that Montana manufacturing employment growth has been about 4% per year since the recession ended. And in general, we're growing faster than the U.S. And in the years when there was contraction, we contracted more slowly. Some of the sectors in manufacturing in Montana that are growing the fastest are fabricated metals, food and beverage, non-metallic minerals, chemicals, and petroleum sector, where we saw the most employment growth and the most rapid employment growth. Now, looking at the output or the sales value from manufacturing in Montana, it's about 2014 was about $11.3 billion. That's in annual shipments. And long-term there, and since the recession, you can see that there's been an increasing trend in output. And a lot of that is due to what's been going on in petroleum products. And so that's why we see this downturn here at the very end of the time series, at the more recent years, with the reduction in oil prices, reduction in gasoline and diesel fuel prices, has been driving the output value down for Montana as a whole, because petroleum and coal products, petroleum accounts for about 55% of that total. So roughly $6 to $7 billion of that 11 is petroleum products. Food's about a $1 billion a year, and wood products are about $900 million a year, to give you some perspective on the other larger sectors. Now, roughly 8 to 10% of the manufactured goods produced in Montana are exported by value. So that's about $1 to $1.2 billion in international exports annually from manufacturers in the state. You can see there that since the recession, those exports went up, but then more recently they've been coming down. That downward recent trend has more to do with the weakening economies in Asia, particularly China's slowdown in their economy, and then the stronger U.S. dollar makes our exports a little less attractive internationally. You can see our top export countries that we export to. Canada's number one there by far, and they're consistently in that top position. And then you see several Asian countries and Mexico showing up. Again, with the slowdown in these other countries and the rise of the U.S. dollar against those currencies, that's why we see that decline in the export value. Taking another look at exports, you get an idea from this slide what types of products we're exporting the most of dollar-wise. And chemicals is by far the largest. That's something like $300 million a year. Machinery, another $120 million a year. Transportation equipment, somewhere around $65 million a year. And you know, the story here again is those larger sectors are where we see the declines: the chemicals, machinery, the petroleum products, transportation equipment. But we do also have sectors in manufacturing with growing exports, and that among those are beverages. I don't know how much beer accounts for that, but it's a favorite buzzword today. Food, fabricated metals, they're up. They've grown on like 140%, $20 million increase over the last couple of years. Computers and electronics are also an area where we're growing our exports. Now, on the theme of exports, there's a couple of pending trade agreements. These are pretty substantial in their scope, and they're going to be coming to Congress in 2016 for approval. The biggest one that affects Montana is this TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Accounts for 11 countries plus the U.S. It accounts for about 70% of Montana exports in terms of the countries that are involved. Again, mostly because Canada is in there, and a lot of the Asian countries that we trade with are there. That has potential to help reduce tariffs on U.S. goods going into Asia, which could be particularly beneficial. The other big trade agreement is this Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP. That's between the European Union and the U.S. That only accounts for about 12% of Montana exports to those countries, and the tariffs aren't particularly high now between U.S. and European countries anyway. Now, each year the Bureau conducts its own survey of manufacturers around the state. It's an effort we do in November to get a handle on what their conditions were during the current year and then during the future, the coming year that we're in now. We had 184 manufacturing firms respond this year, 96% cooperation rate, and over almost an 80% participation rate among the people that we tried to contact. We asked several questions this year related to our theme of property tax. And one of those is, there's these 14 different classes of property tax in Montana, and several of these can impact manufacturers. So we asked which class of property tax impacts your manufacturing business the most. Just over half of them said that Class 8, that business equipment tax, impacts them the most, and then just under 30% said it's actually the land, the property tax on the land and improvements that impact us the most. We asked, well, what kind of impact does that have on you? Not surprisingly, almost half the folks said, it's a negative, it's a significant negative impact on our cost to my business. But kind of more on the wow side was that 46%, when you add these two other lines together, that said, well, it's not that big of an impact. It's kind of neutral, it's pretty minimal, or it's just another business expense. We pass it along in the price of our products, and we plan for it. So clearly, it's an impact to folks, but not everybody thinks it's necessarily a bad thing. We asked about their taxes over the past 3 years. Not surprisingly, about 60% of the firms we talked to said, yeah, my property taxes have increased. We asked them about what they thought for 2016. 41% said, yeah, they're going to increase. And then about a quarter of them said, well, we don't know. That was kind of an interesting finding, that a quarter of them didn't know what was going to happen with the property tax. And then we said, well, there was this reappraisal that happened in 2015. How's that impacting your property tax bill? About half of them said it's going to increase my taxes. But over a third of them, again, they said, we don't know. We're not sure how that's going to impact us. So there's definitely some room for improvement in terms of educating businesses about their tax bill and how much it impacts them. Montana manufacturers clearly think that their property taxes go up and will continue to do so. And even with this increased business equipment exemption, it went from $20,000 of equipment that was exempt up to $100,000. We still see very few that think their taxes, the property tax bill will go down. Of course, we asked our manufacturers about the major issues facing their business this past year and in the coming year. Property tax was not one of the major issues. Nobody said that it was. Actually, the biggest issue for 2015 was finding enough skilled labor, having enough workforce. At over a third of the firms, almost 40% of the firms we talked to said that was their major issue for the year. And then there was general concern about the economy, markets, competition, sales, things like that. For 2016, that response about labor softened somewhat, and I'm not sure if that's because firms kind of worked out what they needed. They got more employees, or they ended up, their outlook for 2016 was, well, maybe we don't need quite as many employees, but either way, that response softened. Just as a note, about 40% of the firms that we talked to on a separate question told us that they did have a worker shortage in 2015, at 40% of the firms statewide. So looking at the manufacturing outlook across the different sectors of manufacturing in Montana, we see that the outlook is still positive. Many firms have had several good years, and majority are still expecting 2016 to be better than 2015. The bars on this graph give you an idea that 0.5 is kind of, if there's a number, if the bar doesn't go to 0.5, if it's too short, that indicates they're expecting a decline or decreasing conditions. And if the further to the right the bar goes, it means the more optimistic their outlook is for the future. Across all sectors, we see that the manufacturers are less optimistic than they were in 2015, but they are still positive overall. Food and beverage is the most positive, most optimistic for 2016. Chemicals and petroleum they had the biggest decline in their outlook, and wood products is actually the least optimistic of the major manufacturing sectors about 2016. Looking specifically at forest products, we see home building in the U.S. has continued to grow. It's growing gradually, more slowly than a lot of people originally or thought several years ago. We hit 1.1 million new home starts in the U.S. this year. The forecasts are calling for 1.25 million new home starts in 2016. That's kind of the good news, is that housing keeps going up, remodeling market keeps improving. A lot of people are trying to improve their home or build a new home, get into a new home. Some of the headwinds that we're seeing are the strong U.S. dollar, the weaker demand for wood products in China, the interest rate hike here in the U.S., the end of the softwood lumber agreement between the U.S. and Canada. These are things all are creating some headwinds for the wood products industry across the U.S. Here in Montana, the ongoing condition is that timber availability from both private and public lands is a major constraint to the mills in Montana. Being able to get enough timber to produce the products when the markets are good or improving is a challenge. There's been a lot of private land ownership changes here in Montana. Plum Creek Timber has sold about, I think about 500,000 acres, maybe over the past 5 or so years. Within that private lands forest inventory, there's a lot of younger, smaller trees. And of course, we have our ongoing issues with federal land management, and kind of Paul alluded to some of the issues with reduced workforce in Forest Service and BLM, which can contribute to this non-increasing harvest on national forest, even though that's where the inventory is. The wood products outlook, overall, it's less optimistic than last year, but it's still slightly improving, slightly optimistic outlook. About 35% of the firms that we talk to, and that's almost 40 firms, think that 2016 is going to be better. About 15% of the wood products firms that we talk to do expect to see a decrease in their employment, though, in 2016. Now, switching here back to the overall manufacturing outlook, kind of geographically around the state, I want to statewide, again, and in most areas, there's still a positive outlook for manufacturing. In fact, here in Missoula and up in Kalispell, we have the most positive outlook for manufacturing in the state, and it's actually a better outlook than for last year. The other side of that, the other extreme of that, is the Billings and Helena outlooks are much less optimistic than they were last year, and perhaps we think that's due to the more manufacturers in those areas being impacted by these global markets, by the downturn in the petroleum prices, things like that. Here in Missoula County in particular, we're in the top 4 in manufacturing counties in the state. We account for about 10% of the state's total manufacturing employment, with over 2,400 employees here in Missoula County and another 1,000 to 1,100 manufacturing employees in Ravalli County. Now, by sector there, you see wood products and furniture, pretty big, 18% there. That's companies like Roseburg, Pyramid Mountain Lumber, Bad Goat here locally, Northwest Factory Finishes, several log home manufacturers, and furniture. Then food and beverage is the biggest. That's the joke. I love to eat, I love to drink, there they are. Chemicals is a really growing area of manufacturing here in Missoula County. Missoula County, in our Montana Manufacturing Information System, that database with the map I showed you at the beginning, we have over 160 manufacturers in the county here in Missoula, and over 100 more in Ravalli County. So there's quite a few manufacturers in our part of the country, or in our part of the state, I should say. Missoula County manufacturing employment and labor income, they were pretty severely impacted by what went on with the Smurfit-Stone container closure and the other wood products closures in the earlier part of the decade. But since 2010, we've seen good growth in Missoula County manufacturing, both in wages and in employment. And here's another one where chemical manufacturing has shown up. It's up about 45%, about $5.3 million in earnings of their employees. Ravalli County, a little bit more mixed signals here in terms of employment and worker earnings. It's smaller, so it looks more volatile. These lines seem to dance around a little bit more. A little bit more variable, and with some recent declines there in 2013 to 2014. Now, the outlook for the Missoula area manufacturing, that would include Missoula County, Ravalli County, Granite, and Mineral counties. About 36 firms we talked to in this area. The outlook is more optimistic. It's the best statewide, I mentioned before, and is slightly better than it was last year. Half of the manufacturers in this Missoula area expect to increase their employment during 2016. Only 3% said they expected to decrease employment. 56% of the firms we talked to said they planned to make a major capital expenditure in 2016, and almost half said they made one in 2015. These are good, positive signs that manufacturers in the area are expecting continued good conditions. Finding qualified workers is an issue for many of these firms. 33%, a third of the manufacturers we spoke to in the area had a worker shortage in 2015. And like elsewhere in the state, of course, healthcare and insurance costs and workers' comp are some of the major concerns. Foreign competition is of the least concern to most of these manufacturers. So that helps us finish up on some good news here in Missoula. Very positive outlook for manufacturing with continued improvements and growth in 2016. With that, I'll be glad to take a question or two, and then you can get some more coffee. Thank you.
Good morning. I was wondering on the question where you asked folks about their property tax, which it's always amazing to me to see how many people have no clue about their taxes, but do you ask them when they say their property tax, especially their business and equipment tax went up, do you ask whether they've added equipment or made any improvements on their building that may have contributed to that?
No, that's a good point. We didn't ask that. We kept it very simple. It just asked them if their property tax went up. But yeah, certainly that would be a kind of a qualifier that if they added new equipment, you would expect their equipment tax to go up. So, all righty. Thank you.
Todd will be available for more questions. I just want to point out that the survey that Todd's referencing is one that's actually for this program. So this is new data just collected, and I think it's very powerful stuff. We're going to turn now to the outlook for an industry which I already talked about a little bit, and that's housing markets. We've already talked a little bit about how those markets have been performing, and I promised you some more detail, and that's exactly what we're going to hear right now. So I'd like to bring up to the podium to discuss the outlook for Montana's housing and real estate markets the newest member of our team, and that's the BBR's Director of Forecasting. Join me in welcoming Kyle Morrill.
Thank you, Pat. You know, I think it was alluded to earlier that we'd have the millennial rebuttal. And you guys probably can't tell, but that would be me. Got my steel water bottle, bike locked up out front, you know, so got it all going. But I am happy to report that I do not live in my parents' basement. So happy about that. My folks also quite happy about that. But I'm not a homeowner, I'm a renter. I'll talk a bit about rental markets today. But I spend a good amount of time looking at housing and real estate data. So I will be sharing some of that data and some of my observations with you. So, you know, we've seen some graphs today, heard a lot about wages coming back, employment coming back, this recovery from the Great Recession, and we've seen it in real estate markets across the state as well. We've seen housing prices rebound in most of our major markets. We've seen sales increasing, inventories going down, new home construction coming back, maybe not to the levels that we saw in the boom years of the early 2000s, but nonetheless, new construction activity is coming back. And within that new activity, we're seeing maybe a little bit of a change in the composition of new construction, seeing more multifamily housing starts when we look at new construction than maybe we've seen in the past. Interest rates, we've seen the Fed move to bump up rates a little bit, and all this kind of begs the question is, are we approaching normal again in the real estate markets, or perhaps are we approaching a new normal? And I think the answer to that question is a little bit mixed. I think in some aspects we're approaching normal, some aspects we may be changing as we're going forward, approaching some sort of new normal. And also embedded in that is kind of a new old problem, question, what have you, resurfacing as we're recovering in housing markets, and that is housing affordability once again becoming an issue for Montanans? So When we look at the last 15 years in the real estate market, we've seen this cycle kind of see three chapters. Early 2000s, we saw strong growth in housing prices, about 70% growth in housing prices on average across the state between 2001 and 2007. At that same time, we saw only about a 30% increase in individuals' incomes. And so throughout that time, as this graph illustrates, we're seeing a growing gap between people's incomes and the cost of housing. Now, of course, in the recession, housing prices fell. We had slower wage growth, or wage growth nonetheless. And this gap between the cost of housing and individuals' incomes was shrinking. Now, people weren't maybe necessarily buying homes at this time, but nonetheless, we have these two kind of measures coming the closest that they've been in some time. Now, turning to the recovery is definitely apparent. We have surpassed the price levels that we saw in the boom years. And meanwhile, wages are kind of growing at a slower rate, and we see this gap between housing prices and incomes growing again throughout this period. And the recovery, it's apparent across the state. It's also apparent here. When we look at Missoula County, we're seeing an increase in number of sales through the last couple of years. We're seeing median home prices rebound. We're seeing average days on the market go down, which is an indicator of kind of the robustness of the real estate market. Going down south to Ravalli County, what we have data for, similar trend. We're seeing sale growth, we're seeing price growth. All of this points to markets looking much healthier in this part of the state. So going back to this old, new question of housing affordability, it's nice to kind of have a benchmark on that, or have a definition for what we think of as housing affordability. Luckily, you don't have to take it from me. There's a definition out there from the U.S. Office of Housing and Urban Development, and they define affordable housing as the amount of housing that the median family can afford at 30% or less of their incomes. So you have, I always get tripped up on this ratio. When you have the amount of housing, when you have your monthly payment towards the median priced home, if that's at 30% or less of the median family income, you have affordable housing. So, of course, several assumptions go into this. You have prevailing market interest rates, you have a certain level of down payment, but nonetheless, holding these factors constant, we can look at this ratio and get a sense of, the housing stress that individuals are under. And so if this ratio is less than 100, we can say that housing is unaffordable by this definition. So what I've done is I've calculated this index for all the counties in Montana for which I have data in 2014. And a couple things are apparent. We can see that for the most part, housing is affordable in Montana. In 2014, we see a trend of the western portion of the state being less affordable than the eastern part of the state. A couple examples, we have Madison County as the least affordable housing market in the state. Of course, Madison County has sales of vacation homes, so it may not be representative of the population there, but nonetheless, we look at Ravalli County, Lake County, all these counties being under that threshold for affordable housing, showing that the average family may be housing stressed there. Again, turning locally here, when we look at this trend over time, here in Missoula, similar trend. Through the recession with lowering housing prices, we see that affordability was growing throughout that period. Now that we're entering this recovery stage, prices are going up, families are feeling the stress a little bit more of the cost of housing. Still considered affordable here in Missoula by that definition, but we go south to Ravalli County, we've actually dropped below that threshold in the recovery years. So as housing prices growing faster than people's incomes, individuals are considered to be housing stressed there. So, we talk about the recession, kind of wonder what's causing this? What are the forces moving the marketplace? Well, like anything else, we're gonna be up here and tell you prices are an intersection of supply and demand. So, supply factors for real estate, we have the inventories of unsold homes, as well as new construction contributing to supply. Shifting to demand, you have economic growth, you have the availability of credit, the ability and willingness of individuals and families to borrow money for a home, as well as population growth and migration. And of course, in the short run, the greatest driver of increases in population is changes in net migration. And something which may be a little bit overlooked is the recessionary impact on population movements. So what I've done is I've calculated average annual net migration for the state, as well as several of Montana's more major housing markets, and you see this trend where in the boom years we had on average about 4,300 net in-migrants to Montana per year, which slowed to under half during the recession. But now, of course, as we're entering this recovery, we're back up to about 4,000 net migrants per year, coming back to where we are before. Of course, this varies through the state. Missoula is actually seeing an increasing trend of out-migration, whereas Ravalli County kind of more mirrors the action that we're seeing in the rest of the state with the recession, slowing down in-migration and then picking up again kind of as other aspects of the economy pick up. Turning to supply, when we look at housing starts, new construction, the state as a whole, kind of as I said earlier, we're coming back. We're definitely out of the trough of the recession. We're not back to the peak years. We're back to about 2001 levels of new construction. And then when we look at Missoula County, a little bit different trend. We're not coming back to those peak levels nearly as much as where we were in the early years. And among the new housing construction, we see a very strong share of multifamily new construction here in Missoula. Going south through a valley, similar trend, but not much recovery out of kind of the trough of the recession, and Ravalli dominated by very low, if any, multifamily starts. So, the housing market is more than just owner-occupied homes. There's a significant portion of people, myself included, who are renters. So when we look back at rents over the last 15 years, these are inflation-adjusted rents, and we see that rent has grown. Rent has grown over that time. In the boom years at about 3.5% per year. And of course, the recession slowed that down to almost nothing, as it slowed down many other things. But coming out of the recession, we're seeing rents increase at about 5.5% per year across Montana, which is not insignificant. And kind of ask, that's a factor of a number of things. But one thing we're seeing at the same time is we're seeing an erosion of home ownership rates across the country. This isn't a trend specific to Montana. We see it in the U.S., but we also do see it here, and we particularly see it in the recovery years at the same time when rents have been growing at a higher rate. So kind of what's behind these trends of people's housing choices? Well, one thing that is happening is wages among millennials, 18 to 34-year-olds, really haven't changed that much since 2000. And at the same time, we're not seeing a whole lot of wage growth. We're seeing increases in student loan debt. We're seeing increasing rental burdens, as that chart alluded to before. All of this cuts into an individual's ability to save and make a down payment for a home. In addition to kind of the income aspects, we're seeing people are deciding to stay in school longer, people are getting married later, people are delaying their fertility choices, delaying when they have children. All these things are correlated with home ownership, and so these are all leading to this decline we're seeing in home ownership rates. And finally, this trend of urbanization. If there's people are living in more urban centers, especially young people, and of course these are places where it's more difficult, housing is more expensive, so it's cutting into these home ownership rates. And so we see all this. We saw this permeate through in the share of first-time home buyers. This data is calculated here for Montana. We've seen a steady decline in the first-time home buyer share since about 2009. This is, of course, bumping up the median age of home buyers. Nationally, it's up to 44 years from 39 years just a couple years ago in 2008. People are renting longer before they decide to purchase a home. We're having a low inventory of housing, just bumping up prices, an aging population, as well as we talked about before, student loan debt. And it's calculated that 67% of students attending Montana universities graduate with some level of debt. The average debt burden of which is $27,000, so not an insignificant debt burden. I kind of wanted to put up this population tree to illustrate the change in composition of the age of the population here in Montana. So what we have here on the left is the distribution of Montana's age in the year 2000, and you see a large spike in the 35 to 50-year-old demographic. As we turn to 2014, you see those people aging into their 50s and 60s, and we're not having an equivalent share of population come in to replace them. And of course, these are the individuals entering their peak earning years, or the individuals entering their home buying ages. So that, of course, has implications for the housing market here in Montana. Turning to looking at what's ahead for the housing market, interest rates. If you look in your Montana Economic Report, we have a forecast of what we expect to happen with interest rates. Expect a slight increase coming forward. It's a question of what's going to happen with credit standards, if they're going to maybe loosen a bit going forward. We have, the government, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, underwriting a larger percentage of home loans, as well as kind of a more specific Montana problem, which is a shortage of buildable lots, so just constricting supply. Probably expect to see that continuing going forward, as well as the Dodd-Frank rule still being digested. Only a certain percentage of that is actually out on the books right now, so to speak, so that'll continue to have implications for the loan market and the housing market. And then specific to, especially the vacation communities here in Montana, we have the Canadian dollar, which is more difficult for Canadians to come down, purchase vacation homes, which has implications for the demand for housing. So with that, I'd like to conclude, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions on the housing and real estate home?
Hi, can you clarify on your housing cost burden charts, is that for all households, or is it just for home ownership?
That is just for home ownership.
Okay, great, thanks. And then have you looked at all at cost burden by age or other demographics?
I have not, no. It's, so when you look at kind of, sale prices and that stuff, those, I don't have data, I guess, that broken down by age. But I think it would be interesting to kind of go into the census. And the census does have a measure of, like, for example, how it calculated the increasing rents. One of the questions they ask in the census is, do you feel burdened by housing? And they use that 30% threshold. And so you do see a similar trend across all demographics, but especially among young people when you look at those kind of bars on that graph of young people feeling that squeeze more than perhaps the older generations. So I think it kind of speaks to that.
Given the increase in multifamily development in Missoula County, here, Pat. Over here, Pat.
Where?
To your right, yeah, hi.
Oh.
Thanks.
Hello.
So given the increase in multifamily development both in Missoula County and the state at large, as well as demographic shifts supporting that trend, do you feel like with the supply coming on in county that we have sufficient absorption? There'll be sufficient absorption for all the supply?
I guess it's hard to look at that, I guess, from a data perspective. It's hard to look at people who are wanting to rent. But certainly, what I see is you got 60% of the new starts here in Missoula being multifamily, compared with some out-migration. I think it's certainly going to help. I guess I can't have a hard number to say that we're going to sufficiently absorb that demand. But nonetheless, with those new units coming online, I think it's it's certainly going to absorb a share of that. But so I can't really speak to the hard numbers of.
Will we see a decrease in rents?
I need where's Bryce? Where's where's that crystal ball? Certainly, building this new supply, I think maybe we'll see a easing off of that 5.5% per year. I would hope, especially inflation adjusted. You're adding more supply, so I think a slowdown might be in order.
Another question? All right.
Thank you.